Hi guys, it's Jess from Honest Fiction, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am going to be sharing your favorite fantasy romances of 2023. Alright guys, it is officially the end of the year, which means it is time to talk about the top books of 2023. So I popped over on my Instagram and I asked you guys, what was your favorite fantasy romance book that you read this year? And you guys did not disappoint. I got so many responses, and actually a few of these fantasy romance books I had never heard of, so I'm very excited to check them out. And if you're unfamiliar with my channel, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. You can also hit that notification bell to be notified whenever I post new bookish content. You can also check out my Instagram and Goodreads, both linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's talk about your favorite fantasy romance books of the year. And the most popular answer by far was Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. So this game is no surprise. Everyone seems to be loving Fourth Wing, me included. So it's definitely gonna be in my top 10 books of the year. I just thought it was so much fun. It had so much action and dragons. Amazing. But the one thing I do think is funny is that only 2 people said Iron Flame was their favorite fantasy romance of the year, and Iron Flame being the sequel to Fourth Wing. So it seems like not as many people are loving the sequel. I ended up giving the sequel 4 stars, a low 4-star. It just wasn't quite as good as Fourth Wing, but it was still really enjoyable, and I can't wait to see what happens with the rest of the series. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the plot of Fourth Wing, we are following Violet Sorrengail. Violet Sorrengail has been raised her whole life believing that when she comes of age, she is going to become a scribe being someone who documents history in this community. Now, when she comes of age, her dragon rider general mother tells her that no daughter of hers is going to become a scribe, and Violet is actually going to have to attend the Dragon Rider Quadrant, where she will hopefully one day compete against other cadets to eventually bond with a dragon and gain magical abilities. So the first book, Fourth Wing, is mostly just following Violet as she tries not to die, because essentially everyone is trying to kill her. And I love the first book. If you're a fan of the Hunger Games and like younger YA dystopian that had a lot of that action, it kind of feels like that, but it also has a lot of spice, and I just love the characters, and the main guy, the main book boyfriend of this, is perfection. I love him so much. So if you've been hesitant to pick up Fourth Wing, highly recommend. I absolutely loved it. And next up is A Ship of Bones and Teeth by Karina Halle. So this is a dark, standalone pirate romance, and it is a Little Mermaid reimagining. So we're essentially following this girl who's actually a siren, and she falls in love with a human, and she ends up begging a sea witch to give her legs. And this does end up happening, however, she also loses her tongue in the process. Anyway, this siren, who now is a human, meets with Prince Eric, they fall madly in love, and then Prince Eric becomes horribly abusive and treats his wife terribly, and she regrets her decision. And I actually love the premise of that story. But anyway, while our human siren and Prince Eric are journeying on a boat, and once again, Prince Eric is being pretty terrible, they are captured by pirates. And it's essentially that siren and pirates love story. And although I have not read this yet, I definitely want to as soon as an audiobook is released. I actually read about half of it physically, and I was really enjoying it. My job just doesn't give me enough time to finish books physically. Unless it's the summer, I have to listen to the audiobook. But anyway, I've heard nothing but good things, and a lot of you said it was your favorite fantasy romance of the year, so I will definitely be picking it up soon. And this next book has been on my radar for quite some time. It is Crowns of Oaths and Curses by Bree. Bree being the same author that wrote the Bonds That Tie series, which is my favorite Why Choose paranormal romance series like of all time. If you haven't read it yet and you love Why Choose, definitely check it out. But the Crowns of Oaths and Curses is the first in a 3-book series, and I believe we are following a fae and a witch. So the fae is the head of the kingdom, or the prince of a kingdom, and there is a war currently going on with the witches, and then our other character is a witch who knows her destiny is to marry the fae king and then help defeat his enemy. The only downside to this is she is his biggest enemy. So, I don't know, it sounds really good. Apparently this is real enemies to lovers, and it is very slow burn. So all of my friends that have read this have said that it seems like this romance is really going to be drawn out, which I actually appreciate. I love when it takes a while for the enemies and lovers to actually become lovers. But anyway, I'm very excited to pick this up, and hopefully the audiobook comes out soon. And next up, a lot of you said The Ballad of Never After, which is actually the sequel to Once Upon a Broken Heart. So you do have to read Once Upon a Broken Heart before going into the second book. I completely agree with you guys. It is also one of my top 10 books of the year. I loved that book so much, and it's actually YA fantasy romance, which is something that I didn't read a lot of this year, but overall, I loved The Ballad of Never After. If you're unfamiliar with that series in general, we are following Evangeline Fox, and she lives in a world where it is known not to make deals with fates. However, her best friend is about to marry her stepsister, so Evangeline is super desperate. She ends up going to this altar and finds Jax, the Prince of Broken Hearts, and she decides she will make a deal with him. So he says he will stop the wedding of her best friend and stepsister if Evangeline, will give him 3 kisses from the men of his choosing, and the story goes from there. So the overall world is just very whimsical, very fantastical. It really feels like a storybook kind of story, and I just loved everything about it, especially the second book, which is really heavy with this like slow burn romance, and it's just so angsty and so good. Unfortunately, the third book released this year, and it was one of my biggest disappointments of the year. I just feel like it wasn't a really good, solid conclusion to the series, but overall, that second book is magical and highly recommend. And a few of you said the War of Lost Hearts trilogy by Carissa Broadbent. So I unfortunately only read the first book. I didn't read the other 2. However, I definitely plan on reading them in 2024. So this is a fantasy romance. However, I feel like the fantasy was pushed to the back a little bit in the first book particularly. But overall, I did really enjoy it. We are following Tisana, and when she was a very young girl, she was sold into slavery and forced to perform performative magic. And she believes that if she saves up enough money, she'll be able to buy her freedom. However, when she attempts to do this, things go awry, and the person that technically owns her refuses to let her go. There is an altercation, and she is able to escape. So she ends up going to this like magical order, like it's like a government magical order of people. It's really hard to explain. Anyway, she goes over there and asks for their help, and they tell her they will not help her unless she kind of becomes a member of their like group. So she has to train under this guy who is essentially General Mustang from Full Metal Alchemist, and while teaching her how to use magic, they like slowly start to fall in love, and the story goes from there. There's also a like really crazy villain, and I'm not even going to try to explain what we find out at the end of that book, but it is really interesting and super unique. So if you are looking for a very fun and unique fantasy, definitely check out the War of Lost Hearts trilogy. This next book is actually one of the ones I had never heard of. So it is called Thief of Souls, and we are following this girl that harbors this dark magic, and she accidentally kills her younger sister. So she is then grown up kind of with a Robin Hood type mentality where she is stealing from the nobles to give to the poor in an attempt to kind of like cleanse her soul and wipe the blood from her hands. But anyway, one day she sees this dying noblewoman and tries to save her, but accidentally steals her soul. So this dying woman soul tells her that there's actually a plot and the kingdom is going to be destroyed unless she does something. So our main character decides that that is how she's going to be redeemed. She is going to stop this plot from occurring, and she's going to save the kingdom. So it sounds really good, and I am very excited to pick it up. Next up is Radiance by Grace Draven, and this is my favorite book by that author. So we are following Brishan, I believe, and he is a member of the Kai race. So he has like gray skin, and I think he has horns, and he just looks very intimidating. And then we have our female main character, and she is a human. So they're forced into an arranged marriage to kind of help their people. And they find each other absolutely repulsive physically. Like, they both think the other person is hideous. So they like slowly fall in love, and it's really them falling in love with each other's personalities. And it is just such a cute story. So highly recommend if you haven't checked that out yet. I also want to say Entreat Me by Grace Draven. No one actually left that as their favorite book of the year, but it's one of my favorite Grace Draven books. And that one is like a dark, spicy Beauty and the Beast retelling, and it's really, really good. So yeah, if you have not read anything by Grace Draven, she is an amazing fantasy romance author and deserves so much more love. A lot of you said To Bleed a Crystal Bloom by Sarah A. Parker. So I read this book last year and really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, I haven't finished with the series yet, or I haven't continued with the series. I don't think it's actually completed, but I definitely plan to do so in 2024. So this is kind of a Rapunzel reimagining, but not really. We're following this guy that ends up coming across this gruesome massacre, and the only survivor is this little girl. So he seems kind of nervous about her. However, he ends up bringing her back to his home, which is this isolated remote castle, and raising her as his ward. And the only thing he asks of her is a drop of her blood every night. Now, we have no idea what he's doing with said blood. Also, there are some weird things happening in this castle. There's also possibly a monster just lurking around. So I will say this is probably one of the most not linear type books. Does that make sense? There's a word for that. But anyway, it is very, very, it's all over the place, but in the best of ways. This is a book that I actually listened to the audiobook and followed along physically, just because there are so many little things that you have to pay attention to, and you're really discovering this world with our main character who has been raised in isolation, so she is very, very naive. But overall, it was such an enjoyable book, and I'm so happy more people are reading it. And next up is more books by Carissa Broadbent. So we have Serpent and the Wings of Night and Ashes and the Star Curse King. So this story is following Aurea, and when she was a baby, she was found by the king of the vampires, who took her to his kingdom and raised her as his ward. Now, she has grown up around a bunch of vampires, and she is a human, so life hasn't really been great for Aurea. So when she comes of age, she decides she is going to enter this tournament known as the Kajari that is run by the goddess Nyaxia. And if she competes to the death and is the sole survivor, she will be granted a gift from the goddess. So the story, or Serpent and the Wings of Night, really just throws you right into this world while Aurea is competing and trying to stay alive against a bunch of vampires. She does end up having to partner up with a vampire from an enemy clan, and the story goes from there. So it is an enemies to lovers story. I will say, for this being such a popular fantasy romance, there isn't a lot of, or the romance feels like it's really not at the front of this story. It really feels like we're just watching Aurea as she tries to survive, which is very, very exciting. However, it does start to kind of build with the romance towards the end, and I heard Ashes and the Star Curse King is actually very romance heavy. So I am very excited to pick up the sequel, but overall, this series deserves all of the hype. I've absolutely loved it and cannot wait to continue. All right, so this next book, a lot of you really enjoyed. However, I have seen so many mixed reviews for this book. So everyone I know who's read this that I talked to, like, personally, has either DNF'd it or rated it fairly low. However, it is like a book talk star, and everyone on BookTube seems to love it. So it is Divine Rivals. All I know about this story is it has a historical fiction type feel, and we are following these two journalists that are competing against each other. And while all this is going on, there are also some gods that are battling, which apparently isn't a very big plot point in the first book, but is gonna come into play from what I've gathered. But either way, I tried reading this book a few months ago. I ended up DNFing it. I just wasn't in the mood. It felt very YA fantasy to me. But I might still try picking it back up. If you have read this book and you enjoyed it, please let me know down in the comments below. Yeah, I'm so unsure. And I love that so many of you said Between Wrath and Mercy by Jess Wisecup. So that was one of my favorite fantasy romances from last year, and it is so unbelievably good. If you haven't read it yet, definitely pick it up. But we are following this girl named Emmeline, and she is trapped in a loveless marriage. However, she does have a daughter, and her daughter is her entire world. That is until her daughter is kidnapped. And then Emmeline has to beg the bloody Prince Rainier for a favor to help get her daughter back. And we find out that Emmeline and Rainier actually have quite a history, and the story goes from there. So I will say this book is pretty spicy. A lot of people go into it not realizing that, so know that going in. Most of the spice happens towards the end of the book. And also, I just love that we have slightly older characters. These characters actually think about things before they act. They use some critical thinking skills. And I feel like my biggest critique in some of the other fantasy romances I read is the fact that the characters are just very impulsive and really don't think things through. But I figured they are like normally 16 or 17, and that's how 16 and 17-year-olds behave. So I just loved following slightly more mature characters. But anyway, I can't wait to read the sequel. It was finally released via audio, so I'll be reading that very soon. And a few of you said The Everking by L.J. Andrews. So unfortunately, I'm still in the middle of reading A Curse of Shadows and Thorns, that series, and I'm pretty sure The Everking takes place after the events of that series. So I didn't want to look into what the book was about, so I'm sorry, I really don't have a really good plot synopsis for you, but I can say it is a dark fantasy romance that involves pirates and Vikings. And that's really all I got. So I'm really sorry, but I love that so many people are loving this series, and I cannot wait to read it. And I had a lot of people name books from both the From Blood and Ash series and the prequel series. Now, I will say if you're planning on reading either of these series, definitely read them in publication order. I've had a lot of people say that they are going to read the prequel series and then From Blood and Ash, and that is not how it is meant to be read, and you will be so confused. So please read them in publication order. But anyway, if you're unfamiliar with the plot of From Blood and Ash, we are following Poppy. She has been being raised as the maiden to one day perform her ascension, which is a ritual, and we don't exactly know what that means. And she is being held in isolation by these people known as the Ascended. Now, the Ascended have black eyes, they stay youthful pretty much forever, and they don't go out during the day. Now, one day, Poppy decides she's gonna be brave. She goes out in a mask just to have some fun at this tavern known as the Red Pearl, and when she gets there, she runs into Hawk, who is the newest member of the Rise Guard and unbelievably attractive. They have a brief little spicy moment, and then she runs away. And then a few days later, Hawk ends up becoming her new personal guard, and the story goes from there. I love From Blood and Ash. It is one of my favorite series. I just love the romance in the first book so much, and it has some of my favorite characters. Now, I will say I haven't loved the newest releases quite as much as those first few, but I still really enjoyed it. Now, the prequel series takes place hundreds of years before the events of From Blood and Ash, and we are following Sarah and Nyktos. Sarah also being known as the Maiden, who is one day going to become the consort of Nyktos, the god of death. So overall, I love the series. It is so unbelievably good and highly recommend. And next up is A Court of Blood and Bindings by Lisette Marshall. This was also one of my favorite reads of the year. So this story is following a human girl, and in her world, there are these different islands. So there is the human island, and then the humans are actually controlled by the Fae that live on the Fae Isles, and the Fae are controlled by the Mother, who is like the most powerful Fae ever. And then she has a general known as the Silent Death, who everyone is afraid of, humans and Fae alike. So anyway, like I said, our main character is this human girl, and she wakes up one day and her entire community is on fire. All the people have left, and standing above her is the Silent Death himself. So that is really where our story begins, and it goes from there, and I absolutely adored the romance in this book. So the hero in this book isn't able to use his voice because of a curse, so our main character actually teaches him kind of how to use sign language, and they just have such a beautiful romance. It is also very spicy. The second book has a bit of a found family feel, and I love it so much. So definitely pick it up if you haven't yet. And next up we have Slaying the Vampire Conqueror, also by Carissa Broadbent. I have not read this yet because there wasn't an audio available when I was trying to read it. I haven't checked recently, but I will be reading this as soon as there is an audiobook because it sounds so good. All I know about this is we are following this girl who is a seer. She has lost her eyesight and also is living kind of like as a street urchin. And anyway, she ends up having to work with a vampire conqueror, becoming his seer, and she hopes to gain his trust and eventually kill him. I'm thinking there's probably going to be a romance between the two, and it just sounds so good and so like something I will absolutely love. So I will definitely be reading this as soon as there is an audiobook available. And last up, we have every single book written by Sarah J. Maas. I think I got every single title in the Throne of Glass series as a favorite besides Tower of Dawn, which is telling. And then everyone said Crescent City 1, Crescent City 2, and then obviously A Court of Mist and Fury was, I think, the number 2 best book of the year. So if you have not read anything by Sarah J. Maas yet, you probably should if you're a big fan of fantasy romance. I adore her books. They are all of my absolute favorites. A Court of Mist and Fury being my favorite fantasy romance book of all time. I'll give you a very brief idea of what each series is about. Throne of Glass is her YA fantasy romance series, and we are following Selena Sardathian, who is an assassin that was caught and is now being taken to a kingdom where she has to compete in these gladiator-type trials. And in doing so, while being at the kingdom, she starts to uncover all of these secrets and mysteries, and the story goes from there. Then A Court of Thorns and Roses is actually a Beauty and the Beast kind of reimagining. We are following Farah, who is a human girl that lives on the border of the human and Fae lands, and one day she kills a wolf, she kills a Fae, mistaking it for a wolf, and then has to live with the High Lord of the Spring Court for the rest of her days. And the story goes from there. And it is my favorite series by Sarah J. Maas by far. And last up, we have Crescent City, which is an urban fantasy. We are following Bryce Quinlan, who is a, half human, who ends up having something very tragic happen to her. So she decides she is going to try to solve this murder along with a fallen angel named Hunt Athalar, and the story goes from there. So Crescent City 3, I'm sure all of you know, is releasing in early 2024, and I cannot wait. All right, guys, those are all your favorite fantasy romance books of 2024. Thank you guys so much for sending in responses. And if one of the books that was your absolute favorite wasn't mentioned in this video, please let me know down in the comments below. And I said this already, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday, and if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. I will see you all next week. Bye!